Hi, I'm Christopher Warnock, and this video continues my current focus on what I like to call the metastructures of astrology and astrological magic and spirituality. In this video, I'm going to discuss some of the most basic structural elements of astrological magic. Um, uh, Jan Culianu is most famous as the author of Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, which is a very interesting study of, not surprisingly, Renaissance magic. Another less well-known but very interesting book of Culianos is called Tree of Gnosis. And this examines the various orthodox and heterodox views of the nature of Jesus. So, in my view, the most salient section of the Tree of Gnosis is the introduction, where Culiano discusses what he calls the morphology of Gnosis as an object or form in space-time. And so, I mean, this seems a little obscure, but it's really kind of helpful in terms of understanding the sort of overall basic structure. So if you think of many of the internal debates about Christianity, they took place over these differing views of the nature of Jesus. Was he human? Was he divine? And Culiano lays out a basic structure of sort of binary choices that all Christian views on the subject fit into. So Jesus was Jesus human or was he divine? Was he only human, only divine, equally human or divine, more divine than human, more human than divine? And if you look at all these various choices and you lay it out historically, you can see that all the various, Arianism and, Monophysites and Ebionites and all that fit into this basic structure. Now they had a different historical background. People that were taking these views had different, basis for why they had the views. But ultimately, every single view can fit into this sort of schema, this factor. So that's really interesting. It organizes everything, and it gives you sort of an overall way to understand this whole area. Now, this seems very abstract, but what's interesting about it is that, as I said, no matter what people's internal views about, well, I'm a monophysite because of this or that, or these theological reasons, or these historical reasons, you can see where it fits into that schema, and you can understand the whole overall issue much better for that. So this sort of view of Culianos came to mind when I started thinking about the nature of astrological magic and the definition of astrological magic. And so one of the things that I like about astrological magic is that, just as the name explicitly says, it combines astrology and magic. And this seems very liminal to me. It's very much on the borderline between both of these areas. And is crossing over between the two arts, esoteric arts of astrology and magic, which I think very much is in the nature of our patron Hermes Trismegistus. So really, our definition of astrological magic needs to take into consideration and deal with magic and astrology, and then what their interaction is. So obviously, there's many possible ways to define astrological magic. So this is my preference. I'm not making an argument here. I'm not saying this is right. I'm just putting this forward as, this is the view that I hold. And if it resonates with you, great. If it doesn't, that's not a problem as well. And there's obviously, as we're going to see here, there's lots of different ways of approaching astrological magic. So I basically laid out this sort of three-part schema. There's three factors for the definition. So first, astrological magic is a type of ritual and ceremonial magic in the Western esoteric tradition. 2, it only works with the celestial spirits. And 3, you work with the astrological spirits or make talismans or whatever you're doing as far as the astrological magic only at astrologically appropriate times. So those are the three factors. Ritual and ceremonial magic, only celestial spirits, and only at astrologically appropriate times. So if you look at 1, this is kind of explaining what type of magic and kind of focusing us in terms of the Western tradition as far as what type of magic we're using and what we're working with. 3, that's astrologically appropriate times, explains how astrology is used. So in astrological magic. So basically what we're doing is we're using electional astrology, which is the art of picking astrologically appropriate times to take action. And that's the primary type of astrology that you're going to be using. Modern astrologers are very focused on natal, so they're going to ask, where's the natal? But that's really much more minor use of natal astrology. Electional astrology is front and center. It's what we're going to use, 70-80% of the time. And then 2, only working with celestial spirits is both astrological in that we're talking about only celestial spirits, and magical in that we're talking about, we're obviously doing magic. So astrological spirits are going to be the spirits that are associated with, say, planets, fixed stars, mansions, the moon. Interesting issue. I think every astrological factor probably has a spirit associated with it. I mean, signs, nodes, obviously, Arabic parts even potentially. But we tend to focus more on certain ones, like I said, the planets or fixed stars or mansions, which, like I said, isn't to say that these are the only ones with spirits, but we just have a more focused approach. I mean, it's probably infinite number of of celestial factors we could be working with. Part of it is, in our tradition, we have information about the planets or fixed stars or whatever from these various sources. We don't have as much information about, like I said, what the astrological spirit, or no information, for example, on the astrological spirit of an Arabic part of fortune, for example. So again, there's practical considerations. So essentially with these three factors, this is my personal definition, we can see how, inspired by Culiano, that there could be many very different combinations of these. So mine says to use all three, but that's not even necessary. You could singly use the factors or use combinations of those factors, and that would also be a way of defining and practicing astrological magic. So for example, you could create an astrological talisman without using any ritual magic or spirits. You'd simply elect the time astrologically for the creation of the talisman and then make the talisman without any consecration, without any contact with spirits. And in fact, this is the kind of talisman that are mentioned by, favorably, because he doesn't like the other type with spirits and stuff, by the natural philosopher of the Middle Ages, Albertus Magnus, in his Speculum Astronomiae. He says there's a third way of making astrological images, and you don't use suffumigations and invocations, nor exorcise or characters or sigils, but the talisman gets its power from the arrangement of the heavens. And so he starts basically explaining how to do a house-based talisman, like for getting rid of scorpions. So you put a Scorpio rising on the Ascendant, and then you do all sorts of various house-based things, like you'd have a ruler of the 8th would be making a negative aspect to the ruler of the Ascendant, etc., etc. So the astrological election then corresponds to the effect that you want, and that's enough for the talisman as far as he's concerned. So this type of talisman that doesn't explicitly use spirits was considered more acceptable in the Middle Ages and Renaissance because they're worried about demons and evil spirits. It's very popular nowadays because people can conceptualize it as being some kind of impersonal energy. So we don't want to work with spirits because that's stepping outside our atheistic materialistic worldview. We want to stick with something that we can sort of slide into that, which is like some kind of energy. So again, making the talisman at the appropriate time without doing anything else. There you go. That's was acceptable to the. But the basis for that was different. Nevertheless, it's a single use of factor 1. Of that factor 3, which is using the astrologically based timing. So again, type of astrological magic. The next sort of, as we're ringing these various changes and possible variations, is we could use astrological timing, but not work with astrological spirits. So the Goetia is a good example of this. They talk about you summon the goetic spirits in the 2nd, 4th, 6th, 8th, 10th, or 12th, or 14th day of the moon. Or the Greater Key of Solomon has a lot of explanation of planetary days and hours, like it says in the hours of Saturn. You can perform experiments to summon souls from Hades, and also to have familiar spirits attending, neither of which are astrological spirits, but these are appropriate astrological timing to work with those spirits. So this sort of basic astrological timing using just the moon phases, moon and signs, or planetary days and hours are very typical of magical timing, and they're simple, they're easy to use, it doesn't take a lot of time to learn how to use it, as opposed to the Albertus Magnus is doing this full chart election. You'd have to really be a master of astrology to do that. So finally, the final sort of possibility would be that you could do ritual and ceremonial magic and work with celestial spirits, but not use astrological timing. And this is not at all unusual for magicians to, like, for example, do a Jupiter invocation and do a whole ceremony and not pay any attention to the astrological timing of Jupiter. This might come from the fact that they don't want to wait. I mean, sometimes you'd have to wait, like Saturn, you might have to wait 6 years to get a good election. You don't want to do that. You may not know astrology well enough. Or it may be that the magician has worked with this planet before, or spirit or whatever, a celestial spirit, and has gotten perfectly good results just by doing the ritual, and they're like, we don't need the timing. So again, this is another variation on these same factors. What I think is really interesting about this is that whatever your internal basis or reasoning for doing this, and you could go on and on about, like, astrologers are worried about magic, and magicians don't know astrology, things like that, is that it fits very well into these basic scheme of astrological magic. It's always the same, and these, you can ascend, it's like I said, we're ringing changes on these various factors. We're only using 1 or 2, or you're just using 3, or you're using all 3 of them, as I do in my definition of it. And what I found really interesting about this is, having worked out these factors and thinking about these possible variations in modern practice, I came across a very interesting passage from the Renaissance esoteric philosopher Giorgio Anselmi's 1542 De Magia Disciplina, the discipline of magic, where he basically proposes a similar classification based on Renaissance practice. He says there's three ways of making images and converting them into figures. In other words, making talismans. He said the first one is natural and occurs whenever you make the image and you only look at the current configuration of the sky. So that's the Albertus Magnus method. He says the second is purely ceremonial and occurs when the craftsman, in order to make the image, takes his material when he wants and does the ceremonies, invocations and everything, and doesn't pay attention to the astrological timing. So again, that's what I was talking about with doing, the ceremonial magic, to the celestial spirits and not astrologically timing it. He said the third method, though, combines both of these and occurs when the craftsman elects the time and then goes ahead and makes a talisman and does, he says, ceremonies, fumigations, words, prayers, invokes the spirits to get their help. He said in this third method, because it uses both the astrological spirits explicitly and invokes them, and then also uses the astrological timing, he said this is the most powerful. So obviously that's in agreement with my view, so I like that a lot. But what I think is really fascinating about this is, again, we've got these same three basic factors and the same variations in use in Renaissance practice as well. And this is a source, like I said, I wasn't familiar with, had never seen this before, and nevertheless it came up with exactly the same schema that I did. In fact, the same approach that I did. And that's one of the things I really like about it. I feel like you've really imbued the essence of the traditional philosophy and practice when you have a sort of instinctive approach, and then you find that same instinctive approach in a traditional source. So again, it's not to say, oh, this is the best, this is the, obviously I'm right, I'm proving myself right, but to say, look, isn't it interesting how having had the same influences, working in the same area, and having the same factors working, that we come up with the same results. So again, this morphological approach holds, and whether we're looking at contemporary Renaissance practice, the same basic factors result in a similar perspective. So I think this is really fascinating, much more interesting to argue about what's right, and that view is just sort of like, I think, disappears like a puff of smoke when the underlying schema is revealed. So again, really fascinating and really kind of, like I said, feeding into this whole theme of mine of looking at these metastructures and understanding the underlying structures, models, worldviews, in this case the sort of schema and definitions of astrological magic. So I hope you found that interesting. Certainly I'm getting really excited about this and kind of delving into it, and I hope to be doing many more videos on this area. So again, check out Renaissance Astrology website for all the practical stuff that I do, but also more of these sort of theoretical and practical discussions.